Good morning. This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene, and today we're talking about hit points in games.
Hit points, yes.
So, a D&D is basically where we get the idea of hit points, right?
I think
hit
so.
points. So hit points signify when you die. To me,
When you die.
So the pros of this is that you usually don't know when people are going to die. I always like to play it as if when I get down to 5 hit points or so, I will sit down on the ground. I will try to run away. I might fall down if I'm down to 1. This way, the people around me know, my fellow players know, not only players, but the actual characters in the game know that I am in trouble without me having to do like the teenagers in my life scream, I'm down to 2 hit points, I'm going to die.
Well, that's pretty cool because, one person I know that really hates the meta of games like that is Felipe, my old D&D and my older brother. He would hate it when people, or doesn't like it, I don't say hate, but he doesn't like people referring to stats while they're playing. I'm down to 14 hit points, and then when people go, how badly damaged are you, and then character B goes, I only got 10 hit points out of 50 or whatever, and he gets kind of bent out of shape about that, or at least he used to.
He still does.
Okay, so, and I understand that, because what does that mean? A character doesn't talk to another character about hit points, about how many magical slots they have. They'll say, I have 3, I can only throw 3 more spells. That would make sense. Or I'm pretty damn hurt. Using a phrase to explain how many hit points they have.
If we don't retreat, I'm going to die.
That's always good. So hit points, you're right. I think if you look at hit points, where they come from, D&D is where it comes from. That there's no denying that. I don't think you can deny that. And D&D comes from this game called Chainmail.
In fact, when I was looking up the history of hit points, there was this article that Dave Arneson, is that his name?
That's him.
He's the co-creator of D&D, right?
Right, original D&D.
Dave Arneson. He did this interview in 2004 in GameSpy, and he was talking about how D&D didn't even have hit points originally. 1 blow would kill a soldier, because that was the way that they played the, I want to say army games, but that's not what they're called, war games. And so he said when they started to experiment with players controlling heroes in the game, that they found that players didn't like it when their heroes died with 1 hit. Right. It wasn't the same as if part of the army died with 1 hit, right?
Right, because they're the nameless masses.
Exactly. So they had already made these rules for a couple different kind of games. One of them was a naval game. It was called Don't Give Up the Ship.
I actually heard of that game.
Where the ship took damage from multiple hits before it went down. Yeah. So that's basically where the idea of hit points came from, was the fact that people didn't want to just take 1 hit and die.
Yeah, who wants that? And how can you make a career, or if you get invested in a character and he just dies as soon as he gets hit? I mean, can you imagine?
I think that's what they found, is that you take the time to create this character, and 1 blow and he's gone. Then you have to create another character.
And even give him a name, because he's a hero in this war game, or war game like
fantasy game.
Yes,
war game.
Yeah, and you give him a name, and and he basically is just another unit that is easily dispatched, and it's just not. It's
not the same when you're invested in a character,
right? So chainmail, that's I think that also still stems from chainmail. So they, they played around with these ideas of moving from a miniature game, war game, to a more of a role playing game like thing. And the precursor of that is Chainmail, right? Because Chainmail, it's basically a war game, but in it you have units that are comprised of heroes, and you have wizards. I think they later came out with the magic one. Their basic hit points were different, right? If you were a veteran, you went down in 1 hit. If you were a hero, you took 4 hits, and if you were a superhero, you could take 8 hits. Which gives them a little bit more longevity, and maybe you would even name your superhero, right? And give them a name and stuff like that. And so that's a real precursor to hit points. And the problem is that when you have a miniature game that deals with hits, a war game like that, and then you can make it into a role playing game, what are hit points, right? People get into real long discussions about what they represent. And when I was a kid, when I grew up and I was playing original D&D, hit points were how much damage you can take, physical damage you can take. And everything pointed in that direction. You know, when somebody throws a healing spell at you, they're throwing a healing spell. They're not throwing, we're giving you more luck spell.
Right.
Right? Because the idea of hit points has changed. Because originally it was, how much damage you could take.
And talking about healing spells, D&D and, well, even games like Shadowrun, where the hit points they're called something else. You have these little boxes that you check.
There's physical and stun.
So as I played a mage in Shadowrun, and the one thing that I thought was really a lot more realistic than D&D was that you can, if you're talking about realistically throwing fireballs, is that you choose how powerful you want your spells to be.
Yeah.
And there's blowback from them. You get hurt by the harder the stronger you want the spell to be, the more chances you have of taking stun damage.
Right.
Or even physical damage.
Right.
So
you
have to base your thing upon well, how bad do I want this monster to die? Do I want it to knock me down on the ground?
The decision of how much power to invest in the spell.
Which is a little bit different than D&D, where, at one hit point, you can still swing your great axe and take that monster's head off before you fall to the ground dead, if something hits you, right?
Right. And there's no what is it? There's no, let's say you start with 100 hit points and you're down to 1. There's no difference between hit point number when you have 100 hit points and when you have 1.
But when you get to 0, you're dead.
Right.
Except now you get 3 rolls to try not to be dead.
Depending on what system, right? AD&D, you went into negatives.
So the most interesting thing about even Shadowrun and D&D, and there's other games, of course, the fact that there's these magical healings, right?
Right.
Instead of just having to go to the hospital or breaking your leg and having a cast for 6 weeks and physical therapy,
magic healing.
You get a potion to drink and then you're fine.
Well,
or a cleric comes and lays his holy healing hand on you and heals you, right?
Yes.
And then you're up and about, no problem. There's no resting time, and you don't have to be home for 6 weeks to be able to go back out and campaign.
So you're right. Hit points. The idea of hit points has evolved, right? Because to me, hit points were always how much damage you could take. AD&D comes around, and Gary Gygax. By this time, people are starting to look at role-playing games, and therefore hit points with a little bit more sophistication. That's what I think it is. And they're like, well, how exactly, or what exactly does HP mean? What do hit points mean?
Leave it to gamers to question everything.
So, at the beginning you have 10 hit points, let's say 8 hit points as a character. Now as you have our 10th level, you have 80 hit points, right? And what does hit points mean? Does that mean that literally you become tougher to kill, right? Well, and that's in game. Yes, exactly what happens, right? Does that mean you have as many hit points as And this was the comparison that Gary Gygax made. Does that mean you have as many hit points as 4 war horses? This big, large creature that it's tougher to kill simply because it's a bigger monster, or an elephant, right? And that doesn't make sense, right? The whole idea that all it represents is amount of physical damage you can take before you expire.
So it has to represent other things, right?
Right, and so that's what Gary was saying. And people have criticized. I gotta buy the Player's Handbook again, because I sold it a long time ago. I think I don't have the original Player's Handbook.
I thought you do. You have the little white box somewhere.
Yeah, but I don't have AD&D, the Player's Handbook. Okay. And so they talk about Gary Gygax's verboseness and the high Gygaxian language that he spoke, which I don't remember it being that difficult, but they go on and on about it. But anyway, so in it, he talks about hit points, and he talks about first level and the 10th level, and what he incorporates this idea that hit points is not just physical damage, because the physical damage is the same, maybe a little bit tougher than when you're first to 10th level. But he says that a 10th level person has it represents luck. It represents also represents
Skill, right?
skill, right? The prowess of a fighter or somebody who's very skilled in avoiding hits that would normally kill somebody of lower expertise. So he's saying, like, let's say in the combat, you know, you take 3 points of damage and this and that and all this, and it amounts to more hit points than what the first player would get, is because those hits represent blows that would normally have taken down a lower level fighter or character, and instead they just, you know, damage them a little bit and bruise them and make them, you know. And so, but basically what he's saying is that you're whittling down the luck and the expertise of the higher level character to the point where, you know, you finally are able to dispatch them. That's how he looked at it, and I think it's fine to look at it that way. And then, you know, and what's funny is that later on you get these people who complain that D&D is hit points are not an abstraction. That's another word that comes up, is that it's an abstract thing. It doesn't talk about, it's not solely based on how much damage you can physically take. It's just an abstraction, a way of making things, people last longer and harder to kill because they have more expertise. Now, I should have written down the person's website, but it might be Myth Enders is this website. But anyway, but they argue that the D&D hit points has never been an abstraction. It represents the amount of punishment that a physical person could, physically a character could take, and they point to the idea of, there's several reasons, and I agree. You know, there's several reasons why it would point to that. There was just like healing potions, right? They're not called, you know, adding luck or revitalizing your mojo potions. They're called health potions, right? Healing spells is another thing. They're not called get your mojo back spells. They're called healing spells. And I think that just has to do with making it easy. It's easier to just say healing spell instead of coming up with something really weird and strange word or group of words to mean that you're getting back your ability to avoid getting killed. Another one was that time, right? In the old days, I hate to say this, but I actually like the AD&D model where you would gain 1 hit point per day of rest. So if you were really injured and had a lot of hit points missing, it would take you days or weeks to get back and get all your hit points back. So he says that obviously represents the fact that it's physical damage and only physical damage. D&D 5th edition did away with all that. And with the what is a long rest, you get all your hit points back.
Yeah, I think that has to do with the newer players.
The munchers.
Yeah. I'm going to have to, well, because then you'd be sitting in camp for 6 weeks, right? Waiting for people to heal up so you could go out again. The monsters might get away by then.
Or you would have to have a cleric or a lot of healing spells.
It could be our culture of you need to do everything you need to do and have everything now.
Yes, that's true. But, you know, I was actually surprised at that. I mean, I was like, wow, really? But there is an option. There's a variant option, right? There's one that says a short rest is 8 hours, a long rest is a week, or something like that.
Now, this is for those grognards because, you know, some people just don't like to get rid of those AD&D ideas. Which is true about anything, and not just D&D. There's also, but it's not only D&D that has hit points, or hit point like things.
Exactly, and so you mentioned Shadowrun. Now Shadowrun breaks up the hit points, for lack of a better term, into stun and body,
physical,
right? And the interesting is that there's not a lot of hit points, right?
No,
right? Yeah, I think the toughest characters probably have like 15, right? But then they break it up. You have 15 stun and 15 body.
No, that's not how it works.
That's not how it works?
No, I had like six stun and 9 body.
Oh, really?
Like that, yeah.
I forget how the breakdown happens.
I don't know how, but when I looked at Augustine's sheet, he had a lot more than I did.
Yeah, well, he's a big troll.
I understand.
Okay.
I just and that is realistic, right? A small human versus a
big armor troll,
yeah, or a dwarf, or someone with a bunch of cybernetics in them.
Right, and so I think I think, and what's amazing about that is that they have these boxes aligned in a row of 3 or 4 boxes. There's 3 rows.
Yeah.
And when you fill up a row, it causes you to have a -1 on everything. If you fill up 2 of them, it's -2, and if you fill up the third one, then you're dead or knocked out. And there's a lot of games that do this. A lot of games that.
And Shadowrun is like D&D in that somebody in your party should most likely take medicine and have a med kit with them, or you should have med kits with you, or you should pay that money that the boys pay so the ambulance will come and get you and take you to the hospital.
Right, the dock wagon, I think it's called.
because it's more realistic, because it's you can die faster than in D&D with 100 hit points versus 15
right.
damage.
Yeah, you need to stop, not get hit.
Yeah, you need
and
to.
armor is very important.
Yeah, or getting behind someone with armor is very important in my case.
So I think every game since D&D has wrestled with this idea of hit points and how to deal with that and what it represents. And I think Shadowrun does a good job. It separates the physical and stun. It also gives you this idea that as you get more damaged, you perform worse. Right?
Yeah.
You get, because a -1 is a -1 to everything you do.
The funny thing is, I was reading about Shadowrun, about the hit points, and they were saying a lot of times the player forgets to take those -1s on their stuff.
Yeah.
Because, I just forgot about it. So realistically, when you're playing a game like that where you do get a negative for when you start to lose hit points or health points or whatever you want to call it, you really should. It's like me, when I get down to 5, one of the reasons I do that is because of Felipe, because Felipe is like, well, what are these hit points that you're talking about? He always says.
Yes, if you mention it.
I don't, but other people do. So I'm like going, no, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to have to step back. And Augustine's like, you could shoot an arrow and then go backwards.
Yes,
so,
you can still.
You gotta, you should take that into consideration, right? When you're not feeling good, you're not going to want to be standing up there. You took a blow from a troll or something, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the major failings or problems with D&D is that right there is that somebody, a character, can fight all the way to 0 and there's no negative effects. Other RPGs like Shadowrun, other ones treat I guess if you get damaged, we have to represent that you're not going to be as good as you would as if you were 100%,
at full strength, yeah.
Right? And other games like Traveler did this in a certain way because your hit points were your attributes. So when they did damage to you, you would choose what attributes you would take that off of, right? So when you went down to, I think it only has like a few attributes. So when you went down to 0 and something, then you would get worse and worse every time something hit you, and 2, you would eventually pass out if one of them reaches 0, depending on which one you use. So and that's an old game.
Right.
The Traveler did that in 1977.
Well, I think the other thing is for hit points that is makes the game exciting, especially D&D, is that you're not just you get hit, you lose hit points, right? There's mechanics to the game, right? You're rolling to hit something, so you have to hit a certain number to actually make your attack, right?
Right.
So there's the excitement of, did I make the attack? Did I not make the attack?
Correct.
Did the bad guy hit me with? Is my AC better than his roll? Right. And then there's the rolling the damage to see, so you know that he hit you, but how bad did he damage you?
Right. Yes, and and it's funny because like people make fun of sometimes of D&D of how they like a 2-handed sword, right? If you get hit by a 2-handed sword, supposedly should do a lot of damage, but let's say you roll really lousy, and then you do like maybe 4 points of damage, and somebody with a dagger does 10 points of damage, right? Because they get a bunch
extra
of pluses,
bonuses,
right? So there's all kinds of stuff that happens in that world. Also,
but that's the way that real life is, right? There's a glancing blow versus
it does happen.
Different kinds of things like that.
Yeah, and so I think like I said, people making games have had problems or had to deal with this situation about hit points and how how hit points or something like it are going to work in different games. I remember, what was it, Cortex Classic now. It was used in, not Firefly, but the Serenity game in Supernatural. And they had stun boxes and physical boxes. There was a difference into what kind of damage people would take. And I think that's an interesting take on hit points, is that they separate the psychological from the physical, and you could be damaged different ways. What is it? How does Call of Cthulhu do damage? They just have hit points, right?
They have hit points, but they also have how much
Your sanity.
your sanity.
Well, yeah, that's
Sanity is more important sometimes than hit points. I got to tell you.
And you don't have a lot of hit points.
No, you don't have a lot of hit points, and you lose your sanity rather quickly if you're playing with Saul, who's telling you everything he sees.
Not everything. Not everything.
Other games, I just picked a couple of them.
Okay.
There's this one called, and I might throw you off because you may not remember this one, called The Riddle of Steel. It's out of print. It was by TROS. It's still available in PDF through some venue or other, it says.
Probably drive-through RPG.
Yeah. They have 3 separate rated components for injuries in this one. And it is shock,
Okay.
a short-term penalty to actions from the initial shock of the injury. And then there's pain, a persistent penalty to actions from the ongoing pain of the injury. I believe pain didn't accumulate, but at the current pain penalty was always the highest penalty yet incurred. And blood loss, a cumulative obstacle against which the player would roll the equivalent of constitution. So that's kind of a little bit more realistic.
And complicated, right? And that's and I think that's what Gary and Dave Arneson and people who still use hit points in their games that they're coming out with, it just makes things really easy. It just, you don't have to deal with all this, because I remember there was this game called Stalking the Night Fantastic, which I absolutely loved. If you have it, it's on PDF. You could read it. It's a fun read. The rules are kind of weird, but it had the same thing. It had this, it had like levels of reality, right? Of play, I think it was. And you could just have hit points, but it also had like, well, we have these special damage things, right? And it had system shock, right? It had blood loss, just like you just said. And it had these like tables about, depending on what firearm you got shot by, it would cause, a hydrostatic shock. And so it really got nitty gritty. I'm like, man, this is kind of weird, because this is back in the early '80s, I guess, is when I first, or late '80s. I don't remember. Could have been late '80s, but anyway, it was in the '80s when I got it, and I was reading this. I was just used to playing D&D, and I was just like dumbfounded with all these like things, and I thought it was pretty cool. Now I never really got to play with all those rules because it just would really bog down play. Trying to figure out your hydrostatic shock, and it also depend on where you got shot, right?
That reminds me of what's the one that you like, the space opera, where if you get hit, there's a chart, or if you hit something, there's a chart that you have to roll to where you hit it, and then you also have to roll to what damage you did to it.
Right. But they just have hit points.
Percentile tower.
But they just have hit points.
Yes, but it's a lot more complicated when you have to figure all these things out.
Yeah, it's true. What's funny is that you're right. I think what happened would be, because it didn't like really matter where you got hit, except for armor, because different.
If you got hit on the arm or the leg,
it might have different armor than in the chest. Let's say if you're wearing a vest or something.
Yeah.
Also, another thing was, depending on where you got hit, it would do less damage. Like if you got hit in the body, your body could take more damage. So I don't forget what it was, but it had different, like if you got hit in the arm, it would give you probably less damage than if you got hit in the chest I remember,
or the head
or the groin. For some reason that would be really bad, at least in almost every game. So you're right. So every game tries to deal with hit points in very various ways. Sometimes to make it more realistic. Like, what was that game you called? I don't even remember the name. The one that you just quoted.
It was called The Riddle of Steel.
The Riddle of Steel.
But now he's going to have to go find this game, people. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I remember there was this game called Living Steel, And I heard that it was a really complicated system, but I don't want to go into complicated systems. Another one that was really complicated was Aftermath, right? Because they had every body part had its own hit points. Now there's some games that still do that, right? And they do it a little bit easier. It just, each arm has,
2 hit points.
No, well, I depend on I forget and I forget what game this is, but it has a little map of the body, right? And it would have like, you have 10 hit points in every arm, and probably 15 in every leg, and then your torso would have 20, your head would have 5. And
that's very complicated.
And if you maxed out that section of the
you
body,
lose it.
Well, you could lose it, or it would become unusable, right?
Okay. The only problem I have with that is if your head only had 5 points,
you'd be dead.
If you lost your head,
yes,
I think you would die.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. Yeah, that's exactly it. I forget what the name of that game was. I just don't remember.
It's okay. You'll come up with it and tell us later.
But you're right. And Stalking the Night Fantastic kind of had a similar thing where you had different parts of the body and different amount of hit points. So it's a real interesting part of a role-playing game is dealing with hit points and how you're going to deal with death or what hit points are. And I still like Gary's explanation that a first level and a 10th level character, basically physically have almost the same amount of punishment they could take.
But it has to do with what you've learned in that time,
right?
From
and so
first to 10th level.
Yeah, like you said,
and what better armor you've gotten in that time.
Foregoing armor, that doesn't matter. And let's not get into armor debate, what it means, but how armor makes you harder hit, and it doesn't make too much sense. But anyway, hit points. If you reason it out that it represents the higher level you are, the harder you are to hit. Even though it would have hit, it doesn't hit because trained
dodged
better.
it.
You dodged it, but not quite dodged it, right? You just kind of a little nick here.
It was a glancing blow.
Really glancing blow. And so, you're basically whittling down your opponent's luck and the speed that they're moving, and they getting tired, and they start bleeding, right? They gain bruised and battered. So I could understand that, and it's abstraction, and I believe that I believe Gary Gygax, even though it might seem like a cop out, like, well, maybe just said that or explained it to explain away why a 10th level character has a lot more hit points than a 8th level character or first level character, and what does that difference make, and what a difference, and why there's that difference. And so I think it's pretty cool. I think it's just, like I said, it's just easier. I think people who make a game and try to be realistic about hit points. I forget what game I was looking at.
What about like Fate? I was reading about the Dresden Files.
Right.
Fate 3.0, I guess it is.
Oh, Fate, everything is abstraction.
Right, but they have, for the hit point thing, they have 3 different tracks: physical, mental, and social. Right. So you can take stress for only a certain amount of time, which, is kind of realistic, right?
It's true.
It's a little bit more realistic than straight up hit points, but it's still hit points, right? The stress is that as you get more stress, you get problems with your rolls and things like that. But once you get to a certain place, you're gonna die or
be knocked out,
be unfunctional.
Well, I think in Fate, what they do is if you lose all your stress boxes or boxes in stress or physical or whatever, then you're out of the scene.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
You're gone. You cannot. Either you're getting knocked out or whatever. Tales from the Loop doesn't have hit points. It has boxes, just like stress boxes. I think it has 4 of them.
Yeah.
As like physical stress, emotional, all that stuff. And so it's actually what that game does too. If you fill a box, then that means you get a negative for every box that you fill. So just like, kind of like Shadowrun, where but it's only one box. I mean,
right. Well, it's like when we played the Alien game.
Yes, it's based on the same system.
I only had like 2 hit points in that game.
Yes.
And it had so hit points. Obviously, you were squishy and you died quickly, but it had more to do with stress on how much stress you could take and how much stress you were willing to take to make those rolls with the stress dice, right? To see, and then what happens if you get over 6 or whatever, and then there's a special thing that happens. You fall to the ground and you can't do anything until someone comes and saves you, or you're
Right.
just babbling.
Yes, and that is Tales from the Loop system also, but obviously it's been catered and changed to fit the genre of the Alien universe, and I think that's pretty neat. Again, like I said, all these different companies and these different creators of role playing games, they have to deal with hit points. They have to deal with whether you like hit points as an abstraction or simply as the amount of physical damage a person can take. You got to deal with it, because how are you going to represent the punishment or how are you going to represent damage that it'll take for you to become unconscious or meet the character's demise? Even Star Wars, right? Because Star Wars, when it came out, the D20, it had to deal with hit points, and it didn't like hit points, right? So they separated into vitality and hit points, and your hit points would never go up. I think once you roll hit points, your initial hit
Is
points.
this the D6 system?
No, D20.
Oh, okay.
Your hit points would never go up, but your vitality would go up, because vitality represented your ability to dodge blows, to do this and that. I think it's interesting. I
got to tell you this one system though that I was reading, because the Star Wars D6 system, they have just things that.
Oh, D6. That's the WEG, right? Not Wizards of the Coast. I forget what this.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't know, but they had the categories are stunned, a minor penalty for current and the next round, wounded, fall prone, and no action for current round, penalty until healed, incapacitated, fall prone, knocked out, can't use skills, and half rate move. Mortally wounded, fall prone, unconscious, may die at the end of any round, and dead. Enough said.
Wow.
So
I've never played that rule set. I've heard back in the day and even today that it was really fun and really gave you that Star Wars feel, because you're throwing buckets of 6-sided dice, and it was really fun. But once your character achieved a certain level, it got really kind of crazy, because I think your damage was based on what level you were.
You're looking at me like I have a clue.
No, I'm trying to remember, and I've never played that system, so I think you could actually buy it. They republished it a couple years ago, a new 30th anniversary edition. It had gone out of publication for quite a few years. Well, I think WEG went out of business, the publisher. Yeah, WEG D6.
Again, you're looking at me
Star
like I
Wars
have a clue.
I understand the mental hurdles that people have to do to understand hit points, and like, it doesn't make sense. I understand that those people who are fighting that
battle in their head.
But
then again, those are the same people who, I mean, it doesn't make sense when people die, right? I mean, in real life, it's
geez.
you know what I mean? It's like, hello.
Okay, and I think everybody's seen those videos where people get extremely lucky, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have, go to YouTube, Escape Death, whatever it's called, and I saw this one guy. He was on a freeway. He's riding a motorcycle, and a car runs him over, runs into him, and he literally flips over the car and lands on the hood, standing. And then he gets off and he starts yelling at the person, right? But I can understand why he might be a little perturbed. But he literally does like literally a flip in the air as this car just smashes into him, and he lands on the roof standing. And he's totally unhurt, and his bicycle's shredded. And
so then he didn't lose any hit points.
No,
but he might have got some stress points.
He probably takes a lot of stress points, right? And you see that all the time. You see, like, I saw this one guy who was being chased by the cops, right? And he's driving he's in a Corvette, right? And he's flying. I don't know how fast he's going. But he loses control of the Corvette, goes he's probably somewhere in Arizona, because it was flat and all he saw was desert. And he crashes his car, right? And the car is just shattering, because it's a Corvette. It's not made to take damage, right? Parts of the Corvette are flying, and you see him, he's in the sitting position, and of course they slow down the camera, and he must have been going like 70 miles an hour, probably faster, and the car is just shredding, because the dirt and the sand is just tearing the car apart. And then they slow it down, and then all you see is a big dust cloud, right? Because it's just freaking dust and dirt and sand. and they show him tumble, like, you know, in the seat, because he's belted into the seat, and it tumbles, and it, you know, he's kind of rolling, and then at the very end, the chair falls off of him, right? Literally, like he peeled, like he's taking off his coat. That's what it looks like. It just comes off of him, and he ends up like on his hands and knees at the very end, and he's totally unhurt. That Corvette was shredded.
So he rolled a 20.
I don't know what he rolled, but what, you know, what I'm saying is that there's weird things that happen in real life,
right?
That you can, you know, maybe weird stuff happens more often in a role playing game, right?
Especially since it is a fantasy game
or science fiction game. So hit points, you know, love them or leave them, love them or hate them.
But you really do need them in the game so you don't get killed.
And, you know, I think that there's different variations that I like and represent a little bit more. What is it? Realistic. And, you know, Shadowrun does it. I think Tales from the Loop is super simple. There's not even hit points. It's just conditions. And as soon as you have like 3 conditions, you're out of the scene, right? You know, and then you know, how do you get those back? Well, like if you get physically damaged, you have to go and get soup from your mom and stuff like that. And if you get stressed out, you got to go to the person that you find is caring about you or whatever, and they reassure you, give you a hug. Now, Tales from the Loop, you play little kids solving mysteries, so, you know, there's no character death, so you're just out of the scenes. But I think it's neat. I think people have become very imaginative about what hit points represent, or how a character can be taken out of a scene or be hurt or eventually killed. So I think it's pretty neat. I think it's a pretty interesting subject. Hit points, love them or hate them. You know, they're here to stay. I think. What's another interesting thing about hit points is that they've actually, you know, D&D has affected the computer world, computer gaming world, right? Because every game has hit points. Yeah. You know, it's amazing. So
there you go.
There you go.
This is Gaming Perspectives with
Saul
and Jolene.
You have a good day.